Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of our 5-week Bible study on the Synoptic Gospels. We're looking at those 3 of the 4 Gospels that are very similar in the Synoptics. So we'll talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Last week we talked quite a bit about the book of Matthew. Today we're going to zoom in on the Gospel of Mark. Next week on the Gospel of Luke. So, and then if you're doing your math, we'll have one more week of our 5-week Bible study, and we'll spend that just kind of comparing the Synoptics with John and some of the challenges that we face with a Gospel of John that is very, very different than the other 3. Okay, so for those who are watching and listening online, I will recognize and admit that the last 2 weeks, the amount of material that we've had to cover has been extensive and just packed a lot in, and I didn't give time for you to ask questions and for me to look at the computer and the chat and to see whatever questions you might have along the way. I didn't see any at the end, but I really didn't give any time for that. But today, I think that the amount of material will be a little bit less than what we've had, and so allow a little bit of time for some questions as we get through. So if you're online in particular, be ready to ask your questions, because when we come to a stopping point, there's a little bit of delay between when I say something here and when you see it online. And so you'll need to be ready when there's sort of a pause to just jump in with a question. And I'll scan every once in a while on Facebook and on our website chat to see if there are any questions from all of you. So good morning and welcome. And it's not that we'll have a little less material because Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, by the way. It's not so much that. Although Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. So fewer chapters, fewer verses, less material to cover, but that's certainly not the reason why we're going to have a little bit extra time today. All right, so what is a synoptic? We've talked about this before. If you put Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, you'll see a lot of similarities in the outline, the teachings, miracles, life events of Jesus, and the order in which they happen. John puts those out of sequence, and we're going to talk about that in a couple weeks and why that is, and some theories about the Gospel of John. But then we're also talking about how each one of the Synoptic Gospels, even though very similar, you'll see a lot of similar wording, similar stories, and so on, each one of them is unique. Each one of the Gospels is telling the story in a little bit different perspective so that we get a full picture. We've talked about the image of your cell phone, your iPhone, whatever that is with the camera, where there are 3 different cameras, different functions, a little bit different angle, so you get a fuller, deeper shot and video or picture. It's not quite as 2-dimensional, but a little bit more 3-dimensional with depth in those added angles. Well, the Gospels act like this, right? We're getting just a little bit different nuance with each Gospel so that we see the same events, recording the same stories of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, miracles of Jesus, but trying to draw out certain truths as they tell the narrative, okay? We've also used the image of 4-color printing, right? 4-color printing will give you a full color instead of just partial color. And each one of the Gospels is like the different color that's being added to the whole mix in order to give you the full brilliance of that image. Last week we talked about the Revelation 4 and how in Revelation 4 John is giving us a description of what he got to see is like if the veil is pulled back from the reality of the world and you get to see the spiritual world that's all around us all the time, and he gets to see that in heaven and the throne room of God. And Revelation 4 is actually a description of John seeing the throne of God and the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne, and then the Lamb shows up, the Son of God, Jesus, who sits on the throne with God, the Father. And in the midst of all that, in Revelation 4, at the center around the throne were these four living creatures. And Revelation 4 goes on to say that the first one was a lion, the second was an ox, the third had the face of a man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle. And we talked about last week how each one of these creatures has been used as an image for one of the Gospels. Since there are four creatures and four Gospels, it makes sense. The early church just started to connect those four creatures with the four Gospels. And we talked about the difference in each of those last week. I won't go into the detail of that, but we're right now looking at Mark, who is traditionally depicted as the lion of those four living creatures in Revelation's vision. And why the lion? Well, Mark has a little bit more, not like Matthew doesn't have it and John doesn't have it or Luke doesn't have it, but a little bit more than the other Gospels. Mark emphasizes the kingship of Christ. Although the kingship of Christ looks different than what you might expect. The kingship of Christ is not like a roaring lion. The kingship of Christ looks a little bit more like what C.S. Lewis depicts in the Chronicles of Narnia with the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the lion lays down his life and then takes it up again. So the kingship, where people expect the king is going to be a warrior coming in to conquer and reestablish a kingdom of Israel over against the Romans who are occupying Israel at the time, Jesus comes differently than that. And his kingship is on full display when he is on the cross. So anyway, there's this emphasis about the kingship that looks very different than what you expect in Mark. And so the lion, again, much like what C.S. Lewis depicts and why he depicts Aslan, this Christ-like figure in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, as a lion, because it's such a scriptural image of kingship. And then Mark also begins with the ministry of, I'm just going to stop moving because every time I move, that's my mic making noise. The Gospel of Mark begins with the ministry of John the Baptist, very right off. It's the beginning of the gospel, and then there's a voice calling out in the desert, and make straight the way for the Lord. And so John the Baptist is like the voice of this roaring lion speaking out and calling out, and everybody's going to notice this. And so a couple of reasons why Mark is depicted as the lion of those four living creatures. All right. Some distinctiveness about Mark, what makes Mark unique. We're going to dig in a little bit into a couple of these issues today, but Mark is the shortest of the gospel, and some actually argue that Mark was the first of the gospels that was written, and that Matthew and Luke probably drew from the outline that Mark established in telling the account of Jesus and then added on to the framework of Mark's gospel. I'm not fully convinced that Mark was the first. I can't argue with the fact that it's the shortest. It's pretty much a given. But again, some people argue that Mark was the first of the Gospels written. It's generally the scholarly consensus, but not everybody agrees with it. There's one of the things that makes Mark unique is what you might call the priority of Jesus' mission. So one of the things that you get with Mark's gospel, especially in the first half, is that this happens, and then immediately this happens, and immediately this happens, and immediately this happens, and immediately this happens, and it's almost, in the other gospels, it'll say, in those days, or after a few days. In Mark, it's more like immediately, because it's almost like Jesus has to get to his mission and nothing is going to stop him, and so you just keep the truck moving. Right? The story has to keep pressing because the most important thing is the second half, literally half of the Gospel of Mark, is dedicated to the account of in Jerusalem And from the triumphal entry to Jesus' passion, his crucifixion and resurrection. Literally half of the gospel is in the passion narrative. So there's a priority given to that mission that Jesus is on. We'll pick up on that in just a little bit as well. One of the unique features of Mark is not that the other gospels deny or don't elevate Jesus as Son of God, but it's certainly one of those themes or motifs that is more prevalent in Mark among the Synoptics. I would say John certainly elevates this even more than Mark as Jesus as Son of God. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, the focus on action more than words. Again, the story just keeps pushing through. And so one of the things that you should know about Mark is if you're reading through Mark and there's a detail in the story, you should take note of the detail. I could probably pick out lots and lots of examples, but as you're reading through Mark, everyone, because it's short, because it's so fast-paced, if Mark is giving you some detail about something, pay attention to that detail. He's telling you that for a reason. And then another unique feature of Mark is what, I don't know anybody else who calls it this, but it's a narrative sandwich. A narrative sandwich. Mark likes to put 2 or 3 different, what we call pericope, right? If you took a small little chunk of the overall narrative, usually in your Bible where there's a heading between chapters or between verses, I just happen to be in Mark 10, and between verses 16 and 17, there's a heading that says, the rich young man. And you know from verses 17 through 31, that section, because there is a heading there, the rich young man, that whole pericope, that whole part of the narrative is one piece. By the way, every one of those headings is an editor's commentary that is not original to the Gospel Mark. Mark didn't write along and then say, oh yeah, let me give a chapter title to, or a subheading of the chapter, the rich young man. No, it didn't say any of that. It just flowed right from verse 16 to 17. And then where there's a break between chapter 10 and 11, there were no chapter numbers, no verse numbers. Mark didn't write those numbers in there. That was 400 or 500 years later, actually 1,200 years later. We got to talk about putting some numbers in here because it's hard for us to talk about these accounts and talk about the same spot. It would be a lot easier if we had some verse numbers and chapter numbers to break it apart, and then we can talk about, oh yeah, in Mark chapter 10, verse 17. Okay, I know exactly where you're talking about because I can go there in my Bible also, right? So that's all commentary. The breaks between chapters are commentaries from the editors who decided to put that number right there. Like, oh, you should have a break. Okay. Anyway, so Mark likes to take some of those little pericopes, those little segments of text, a story about the rich young man, and then the next section says Jesus again predicts his death, and then the request of James and John. And speaking of those 3 pieces, let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. Because this is an example of a narrative sandwich that Mark likes to use. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Starting in Mark 10, verse 17. As Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. Good teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, why do you call me good? Jesus answered, no one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, do not defraud, honor your father and mother. And then he says, teacher, all these I have kept since I was a boy. Jesus looked at him and loved him. One thing you lack, he said. Go, Sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." Then what happens? At this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth. And Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God." The disciples were amazed at his words, but Jesus said again, "Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." Now, we start to get into sort of the point of the narrative sandwich here. The disciples were even more amazed and said to each other, "Who then can be saved?" And Jesus looked at them and said, "With man this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God." Peter said to him, "We have left everything to follow you." And Jesus says, and this, getting into the words of Jesus is the one side of the sandwich, sort of one of the pieces of bread on the narrative sandwich, okay? So Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me in the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age, homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, fields, and with them persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first." So he's using this, okay, again, this is one piece of the bread. We'll get to the other piece of the bread and the meat in the middle in just a second. But one piece of bread, Jesus is saying, many who are first will be last, and the last first. Now jump ahead to verse 35. Mark 10:35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked, as if he didn't know, right? They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." By the way, this is a little bit of a side, but remember I said that the kingship of Jesus looks different than what people expect? When James and John say, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory," when is Jesus most in his glory on earth? It's not when they are on the Mount of Transfiguration. It's actually when he's hanging on the cross. He's most in his glory on the cross. The book of Proverbs actually says it is to a man's glory to overlook an offense. Think about that. It is to a man's glory to overlook an offense. And if God is going to be glorified by overlooking an offense, how much more is he glorified by overlooking all offenses, which he is able to do at the cross of Jesus because Jesus took it all upon himself. Every sin ever committed on Jesus on the cross. So the glory of Jesus is fully on display when it doesn't look like glory in earthly eyes, right? Earthly terms. Glory looks bright and brilliant and victorious and all those things. But no, Mark depicts the glory of God on a cross. So when James and John say, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory," later in the gospel, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, Mark will tell us, "And there were two thieves crucified with him, one at his right and the other at his left," using the exact same phrase that James and John use right here, one at your right and one at your left. And so they have no idea what they're asking, right? But what's going on here in this scene? They're asking, "We want to sit at your right and your left. We want to have those places of honor. We want to be recognized as important. We want to be great." Now, if you go on, then at the end of this pericope, in verses 41 and following. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant. And Jesus called all of them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Okay, so here's the second piece of bread. You might say this is the bottom piece of bread. Okay, the top piece of bread was Jesus saying, "Many who are first will be last, and the last first." Now Jesus is saying, if you want to be great, you must be slave of all. That's the bottom piece of bread. What's the meat in the middle? Well, obviously, that's the pericope I skipped over, right? So you have verses 17 through 31, and you have verses 35 to 45. In the middle, you have these three verses, verses 32, 33, 34. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. And the disciples, by the way, just pause there. This is an interesting, just a very small, almost very subtle detail that Mark includes that nobody else includes in the Gospels. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. None of the other Gospels have this phrase, with Jesus leading the way. Remember I said, when there is a detail, pay attention to it? Okay, so what does this mean? Jesus is literally, physically, in a position of being first. He is first on the way. He is leading the way. And the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." My point in talking about the narrative sandwich, and I'm not the only one who recognizes it, I just don't know anybody who calls it this, right? So on one side you have first will be last, last first. On the other side, let us be first. Jesus says, no, if you want to be great, you have to be slave of all. Even the Son of Man came to serve. And in the middle, you have Jesus predicting his death. And I think that what happens is that when Jesus is talking about the first last and the last first, and if you want to be great, you have to be slave of all, and his prediction of his death right in the middle, it emphasizes what Jesus is going to be doing when he goes to Jerusalem. It emphasizes that Jesus, who, again, Mark puts him as leading the way along the path, Jesus leading the way, he's first. But what's Jesus going to do? Literally, he is going to become last. He is going to become slave of all. In fact, he really kind of already has, even at this moment in the narrative. Paul picks up on this in Philippians 2, and he says, even though Jesus was by very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant. And that word servant there is the same word as here in Mark, a slave. The Greek word is doulos. It's a slave. He became a slave of all. Being found in appearance as a man, he became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Right, so you get this, Jesus has glory, but he empties himself of his glory to become a slave of all and dies on a cross. That's what Mark is talking about that by putting these stories together, scrunched together, side by side, and he helps us to understand what Paul is talking about. Even if you didn't have Paul talking about in Philippians 2, you'd still pick up on this in Mark's gospel. That here is the one who is first, who makes himself last, and a slave of all, and giving his life as a ransom for many. Even while there are those who are trying to put themselves in a position of being first, when they have no right to ask to be first. It highlights what Jesus is doing. Does that make sense? It emphasizes what Jesus is up to, laying down his life, becoming last, even though he's first. There's another example in Mark 11 of a narrative sandwich. You have, we won't go into the detail of this, but what is called the Triumphal Entry. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. And as he's entering into Jerusalem, he sees a fig tree. He says, "Oh, it's starting to bud, and so I'm going to go over there and see." The buds are edible buds. Even before the figs actually come out on the tree, you can eat the buds. But there are no buds on the tree. So Jesus curses the fig tree. Then he goes in the temple, and then he comes back out again, and the disciples see that the tree that Jesus cursed is withering and dying. And then what happens right in between? I said that he went into the temple, but what does he do when he's in the temple? This is the story where Jesus is clearing out the temple. He's turning the tables over because he's angry that the religious leaders of the Jewish people have made the temple into what he calls a den of robbers, right? He made it into a marketplace where people are being cheated. Instead of a place of prayer, it's a place where people are utilizing these means of dishonest gain. And so he's angry with this. And so in the middle of Jesus cursing the fig tree and the disciples noticing the withered fig tree is clearing the temple in between. And theologically, when you have this sandwich put together, you can understand that what Jesus is doing is actually what Mark is doing by putting these stories side by side like this and emphasizing that these things happen in this kind of sequence is that the old order of things, the old order of the temple and the sacrificial system and all that has been taking place since the time of Moses is about to wither away and die because something greater is here. Now, it doesn't talk about something greater here yet, but there's something about the temple and the sacrifice and the whole order of the old way that will wither just like the fig tree. Mark wants you to pick up on this by putting that clearing of the temple between the cursing and the withered fig tree. That make sense? Another one of these narrative sandwiches. I'll give you one more example, although I'll call this a half sandwich. It's not really a full sandwich, but Mark putting two stories side by side. Mark chapter 4 and Mark chapter 5. At the end of Mark chapter 4, Jesus is on a boat with his disciples crossing over the Sea of Galilee, and there's a storm that rises up, and of course, his disciples wake him up and say, "Lord, we're about to die." And Jesus calms the storm. And then they land on the other side of the sea from Capernaum, where Jesus spent most of his time in ministry here on earth. On the other side is the region of the Gerasenes. And at the beginning of Mark chapter 5, then, Jesus heals a man who is possessed by a legion of demons. Remember the story where Jesus interacts with these demons? And what's your name? We are legion. It's not like I am legion. We, because there's so many of us. This man is possessed by so many powerful demons. And Jesus casts them out, and they go into the pigs, and they run down the hill, and they are drowned in the sea. Right? Well, I'm gonna contend that there's actually more going on in the calming of the storm than just Jesus showing that he has power over nature. There's a there's a belief in the ancient world that the world was sort of like this table right here. Okay, there's a flat surface, right? When they believed that the world was flat and not spherical or round, and underneath the table was called under the earth, or Hades, or hell, right? Under the earth. And above that was the firmament, or the heavens, place where God dwells in his glory. So there's earth, there's under the earth, and there was above the earth in heaven. And where you had a break in the earth, the break in the land, was water. And water was a place where evil spirits could come and go from hell to earth, in that break of the earth. So where the Sea of Galilee was, anytime the storm rose up, this is sort of this spiritual way of describing. It's not just the wind blowing across it in a certain way, or earthquake or something that causes the turbulence in the water. No, it's demons who are coming out of the underworld into our world, and they're causing a disturbance, right? In other words, when the storm rises, all hell is breaking loose. So they're thinking there's much more to this. Like if they get sucked down into the bottom of the sea, they're done for. It's like getting sucked into hell itself. So there's a greater fear than just a storm rising up on the sea. And so by Mark putting this story, this calming of the sea, calming of the storm, right next to the healing of these the demon-possessed man, casting out the demons, he's putting these side by side for a reason. Not just because they're historically side by side. As we get to John has a whole different sequence to his narrative. And we don't know historically, did these happen in the sequence that Mark describes it, or the sequence in which Matthew describes it, or the sequence in which John describes it? Because they're different. But the point isn't that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not trying to tell you the story in exact historical sequence. Like we want, if it's going to be true, it's got to be exactly historically accurate, like a journal. Right? You gave exactly this, and this. No, they're trying to get truths across by telling a story and putting these accounts side by side, so that we can learn certain truths about God and about Jesus Christ. Okay, so why the narrative sandwiches in Mark become an interpretive tool for us to help explain. You might use the word juxtaposition. Mark juxtaposes. He puts side by side two different accounts to draw out truths about both of those accounts. A couple weeks ago, I used the example of the man who was partially healed of his blindness and then fully healed of his blindness, remember? And the story just before that where the disciples are blind, don't you see? And then after, Peter sort of has this partial understanding, you are the Christ, the Son of God. Oh, but we're not going to let you suffer or anything. Right, so he partially sees, and the story right in the middle is juxtaposed in the middle right there. There's a sandwich of this man being partially healed and then fully healed as a way for us to start to unpack what's going on with the disciples. It's a bigger story than just a healing of a blind man. So anyway, all those are examples that are unique to Mark. You start to interpret Mark a little bit differently then. Sorry about the popping in the microphone. Not sure why it's doing that. Okay, so back to some of this list of uniquenesses from Mark. Before I get to the next section, any questions from you, those online? I'm going to take a quick peek at where we are with our study online, see if there are any questions. Not seeing any so far online. Yeah, Dennis? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. The way that Greek was written at that time, so Greek was the original language of the New Testament. And nowadays, and even in the second, third century, the Greek language changed enough that there were capital letters and lowercase letters in the language. But at the time of the first century when this was written, it was all written in capital Greek letters. So it's all caps. And then to add really interesting challenge to it, Greek was written without spacing between words. So imagine if the Bible that we have, you put every one of these words into capital letters and then and you took away the spacing between words. It just all ran and then you get to the end of a line, and you could be in the middle of a word, and that word would continue on the next line without a hyphen to indicate, oh, by the way, this is a broken word, and it continues on the next line, like we have in our Bibles, a little hyphen to break up a word. No. It just would end a line, continue that word in the next line, and so on, with no spacing in between words. So it becomes really challenging when you look at the original. And we don't have original manuscripts. We have very early manuscripts that are that they have those capital letters all running together. Even those who know Greek have a challenge with understanding it. And so it takes quite a bit of scholarly effort to understand where that breaks up. Now, some will say, well, that just means that there's not a lot of accuracy, because who's to say that a word should be broken here and not here? There's almost no place that I can think of where there is some sort of doctrinal matter that is that swings one way or the other because of where you place the break between words. You would get it if you read in English all capital letters with no spacing. You would be able to read it. It might take a little bit more thought and effort, slow down a little bit, but you'd be able to read it, and there would be almost no dispute on where the breaks in those words would be, because you know the language, right? It's just the way it works. One word put next to another one, not a big deal. But yeah, so to Dennis's point, that is true about the New Testament scriptures. Other questions? All right. I want to focus for a few minutes then on this next part, which is the second bullet point on the screen, the priority of Jesus' mission. And one aspect of this that is sometimes called the Messianic Secret. The Messianic Secret. So if you go through the Gospel of Mark, this is not exclusive to Mark's Gospel. Certainly there are a couple places where let's say if you look at Mark 1:44 and the healing of the leper, and in a lot of Bibles, mine included, it'll tell you the parallel reference to the other Gospels. Where does this occur in Matthew's Gospel? Where does this occur in John's Gospel? And so on. So Mark 1:44, this is not unique to Mark, but it happens more often in Mark. And it certainly is a motif that is more prevalent in Mark's Gospel. So Mark 1:44, the healing of the leper, you get to the end of that account, And what does Jesus say? See that you don't tell this to anyone. Skip ahead to Mark 3. The evil spirits are crying out, "You are the Son of God." In Mark 3, verse 12, Jesus says, or Mark tells us, Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. Mark 5, verse 43, the raising of Jairus' daughter. He gave them strict orders not to let anyone know about this. Wait a second. I thought we were supposed to tell the good news. We're supposed to be witnesses about Jesus' work and how great he is. I thought we were supposed to spread the good news. Go and tell all nations, right? Baptizing all nations in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all that I have told you. What about that? Mark 7, verse 36, the healing of the deaf-mute man. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. Mark 8, 26, last example. Healing of a blind man. Jesus sent him home saying, don't go into the village. Why not? Because if you go into the village, you were blind and now you see, everyone is going to know. So why the secret? And this is not sort of the reverse psychology kind of thing where you say, don't look in here. What's the first thing you want to do? Look in here. Right? It's not that. Jesus isn't saying, don't do this so that they naturally want to do it. Jesus is fully instructing, giving strict orders. Don't tell anybody. Don't let this be known. Why? Why the secrecy? And isn't this contradictory compared to what Jesus says elsewhere? Actually, including in the Gospel Mark, when he heals the man with the legion of demons, he says, now go and tell your family just what God has done for you. And he went and told just as he said. And the word spread in that region all about Jesus. So Jesus has allowed that to happen on the other side of the lake. Why not in Galilee, where Jesus is spending his ministry, where he's healing the deaf-mute man, where he's healing the blind man? Why is he saying, don't tell anybody? Afraid of what? Afraid that they're going to mess up the plan? How do you mean? What he came to do, which is what? Yeah, he came to die on a cross. And so the priority, and this is why I said, this that second point on the bullet list of the uniquenesses of Mark, the priority of Jesus' mission. It's not that Matthew doesn't give priority to Jesus' mission, not that Luke doesn't emphasize this also. In fact, you get to Luke, and it says in Luke chapter 9, from that point on, he set out resolutely to Jerusalem. Right? So there is that emphasis in Luke. But Mark, the way that he prioritizes Jesus' mission by emphasizing how Jesus wanted this messianic nature of his ministry to remain quiet, because if you ever go to the Holy Land and you visit the city of Capernaum or town of Capernaum, it's a small town where Jesus spent most of his public ministry. You'd be surprised. Like, the entire town would fit on this campus here at our Celebration Ministry Center. The whole town. Compact houses, even with a synagogue. It's a small place. The word would travel in an instant. In fact, it did. Even when Jesus said, don't tell anybody, everybody knew. Why there were large crowds that started to gather and so big that they pressed up against him on the seashore, so he had to get in a boat and push back a little bit to teach because there were so many of them. The word spread in Capernaum, and then spread from Capernaum to Tiberias and Magdala and and Bethsaida and the other towns that are in that area surrounding Capernaum. And people were coming from all over the region then to see him because the word was spreading so quickly. And just pressing in. And, well, number one, it kept Jesus from having any time on his own with the Father in prayer, which he loved to do, to go to a solitary place so he could pray, and he could hardly get away. And then there were so many sick people, so many people who were needing healing and so much teaching to do that he could spend an entire lifetime healing and teaching and never get to his mission, the true mission. And so if he got too caught up in all the healing and teaching, he might be kept from his primary mission. And his primary mission was the cross. So Phil, I think you're right on. This, the secret kind of has to be kept under wraps a little bit. Funny, Jesus says, you don't light a lamp and keep it under a bowl, right? You put it on a hill and let everybody see it. So let your light so shine. Well, that's Gospel of Matthew. And Mark is like, no, keep the lamp hidden for a while. It's like, keep this, shh, don't let anybody see this. In the area on the other side of the lake, in the area of the Gerasenes, it wasn't as big a deal because that's in another region. He's only there for a short time. He goes back to the other side of the lake. And now, granted, they can travel from one place to the other, and they could come to Galilee to see him, but it wasn't as big a deal for that word to spread on the other side of the lake. It was a bigger deal where Jesus was spending most of his ministry. Okay? So, any questions about that, this Messianic secret? Dennis? Yeah, well, so Dennis said, isn't it a little bit also that he didn't want to be known as a miracle worker? He wanted to be known for his word and for his action. There may be some truth to that, but I think that Jesus was perfectly fine with doing the miracles and being known for the miracles because it gave credibility to his authority, right? When you read through the Gospels, including in Mark, when Jesus taught, there was this sense that this is different than what everybody else says. Pastor Aaron can get up there and teach, and yeah, we might learn a thing or two from him, but when Jesus gets up there, oh, man, it's like there's an authority there that nobody else has. Right? And the miracles give even more credibility to that, more weight to his authority. And so when he teaches, people are really paying attention because this is someone from God. Nobody could do the works. Nicodemus says this in John chapter 3. No one could be doing the works that you're doing if they didn't come from God. And so I think Jesus is just fine with being a miracle worker and performing those miracles. It's just not his primary task. And last point on this, the miracles actually, I think, also serve a secondary purpose, and that is to give a foretaste of the world to come. When we get to the resurrection and Jesus Christ comes back and restores things the way they're meant to be, and you might say Garden of Eden restored again, paradise restored. When that happens, there will be no disease, there will be no disability. No one will be lame or deaf or blind or any of those things that are limitations that are products of a sinful world. All that will be gone. And when Jesus is healing, he's giving a taste. Now, some people say, well, why didn't he heal everybody in Galilee? He certainly had the power to do that. Jesus could very easily. He didn't even have to touch anybody. He didn't have to he didn't have to speak a word. He could heal people just by them touching, or he could do it with his mind, right? certainly was able to do that with no problem. But why didn't he heal everybody in an instant? Because if he healed everybody and all those diseases and all the worries of this life were over, we would lose sight of the true kingdom that Jesus came to establish. And that is not this earthly, this present age's kingdom. It is a kingdom to come. It is a heavenly, restored earth kingdom that is that's still. So it's a foretaste, but not the full restoration yet. And so, by Jesus not healing everyone, there's still a hunger, a thirst for what is yet to come. So Dennis, I think that he's fine with being a miracle worker, but he didn't want to be known only for that. Much more important is the crucifixion and resurrection. Yeah, Ken? If Jesus would have healed everyone, there's a great chance that they would lose faith. Yes. You would think that if, so what you're saying is you would think if Jesus healed everybody, they just keep coming back in gratitude for all that he has done. Except then Luke tells us about 10 lepers who were healed, and only one of them came back to praise God. Everyone else is like, oh, wow, I'm healed. Go about your regular life. Only one of them came back. And so there's this sense, in this life anyway, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so even with the healings, if everybody were healed, you still have this, we're in the sinful world. And the Israelites walk out of Egypt on dry ground because God parted the sea. And they have this pillar of fire that goes ahead of them by night and a pillar of cloud by day. And yet they doubt that God is with them. They just saw a more miraculous thing than we have ever even imagined, and yet they doubt. The disciples at the end of Matthew, it's very interesting. They see the resurrected Jesus. Some of them believed and some doubted. And then Jesus gives the Great Commission. So there's still in this present age, there is this nature within us where we forget, we doubt, we neglect to give full credit where credit is due. And so I think Jesus knows this. He knows the nature of man. And there's Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, says, there was given to me a thorn in my flesh, right, to keep me from being conceited. If that were taken away from him, he might think a little bit too much of himself and boast in his strength or boast in his ministry, boast in his successes. Instead, by having the limitation, by having that thorn in the flesh, Paul remains humble. There's a sense that we still sort of need the limitations of this life so that we don't get content with this life. We're looking forward to the age to come, and we don't lose faith. So, great comments, great questions. Others, I'm scanning online as well for anybody who might have a question there as well, and not seeing any. Yeah, Judy? Yes. Yeah, he's told some people, your faith has healed you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that it's interesting, isn't it? You pray for people. So Jesus commends people for having faith so that they would be healed. And then people that we know praying that they'll be restored from cancer or some other disease, and then it doesn't come and they die. Well, does that mean they didn't have faith? Well, if you just had faith, you would be healed. No, sometimes the healing comes in a way that is not in this life. And that's part of the same thought that if Jesus took away all of those afflictions, well, then we would make our home here in this present age instead of living for the age to come. Where Peter says we are sojourners here, our home really is in heaven on earth in the resurrection. Okay? Our true home is not here. If you had no worries in this life, you'd be awfully content, right? If you had no struggle, if you had no pain. We're not made for this. There's a reason why in the book of Genesis, after the fall of Adam and Eve, they have eaten from the tree that God commanded them not to eat from. And then Adam and Eve are restricted from being able to eat from the tree of life after that. Why? God doesn't want us living forever in a fallen state. If they had eaten from the tree of life after having committed sin and brought evil into the world, we would live forever fallen. Right? No, God doesn't want us to live forever fallen. He wants us to live forever restored. So that restored life is yet to come. Sometimes people are healed in this life. Sometimes they're healed for the next life, for sure. Yeah, last thoughts. We're getting just really close to the 11 o'clock hour. Just a few minutes. There was one other section we could talk about, the uniqueness of Mark, but it's not necessary. Just in how Mark's gospel ends so abruptly in Mark 16. I find that very interesting. But I'll give just a moment to allow any questions online or here in the gym. Ken? There's a lot here, is what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, we could spend an entire series of Bible studies just digging into some of the detail of one of the gospel sandwiches, right? The narrative sandwiches in Mark's gospel. We could spend just a whole series of Bible studies, several hours, talking about the Messianic Secret. We could spend a whole series of Bible studies talking about why does Mark's gospel end so abruptly after verse 8 in Mark 16, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff. But this is an effort to give just a broad overview of the gospels and the nuances of Matthew, Mark, and Luke for now. Yeah. Stay tuned for other studies in which we dig deeper into those individual things, right? Yeah. As you said, it takes your breath away how deep it is. Yeah. There's a reason, Paul in Romans, I'm doing a little reading right now on Romans 9 to 11. If you want some deep reading, just read Romans 9 to 11. See if you can figure that out. But then at the end of Romans 11, Paul just breaks into a doxology. Oh, how great is the wisdom of God and his ways beyond tracing out. It's just, he's talking about something so deep that it takes his breath away, and he just has to break into praising God for the vastness of his knowledge and wisdom that is beyond our being able to figure it out. Ephesians chapter 3 is blown away by how wide and how broad and high and deep is the love of God. Just blown away by it. I say this all the time, that the Bible, you could read it at a surface level and understand, right? You could understand it as a third grader, as you're just starting to read, and so you're picking up on, okay, Jesus died for me, got that. You can also pick just one of these small sections. And scholars do this. They'll spend a lifetime just boring down into the depths of one section of the Scripture and become an absolute expert at that one little section, because you can never exhaust the depth of its meaning. It's amazing. So, oh yeah, Revelation, yeah, Bible class where it blows you away. You can't even understand it all. Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, great to be with you all again. God's blessings this week. Next week we'll pick up with the Gospel of Luke and the uniqueness of that third of the Synoptics. And until then, have a great week. I hope to see you next time. God bless.